thought I was coming home to an empty house. My husband had texted me that morning, a single breezy message, the kind he sent when he'd already made a decision he didn't want to explain. Taking Mom to the shore for a few days, back Sunday. Don't wait up. I stood in the break room at work reading those 12 words 3 times, trying to locate the part of the sentence that mentioned Eleanor, trying to find the piece of the message that said they had arranged for someone to check on her, that a neighbor would stop by, that they hadn't simply closed the door behind them and driven away. I couldn't find it because it wasn't there. What I found instead, when I pulled into our driveway at 6:15 on a Thursday evening and walked through the front door into the thick, stale silence of the house, was a handwritten note pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the Eiffel Tower, a souvenir from a trip Daniel and I had taken 3 years ago before everything became what it eventually became. The note was in Carol's handwriting, which I recognized by the aggressive, forward-slanting letters that always looked like they were trying to escape the page. It said, "Deal with this wreck yourself. We needed a break. Don't be dramatic." 6 words for a human life. Don't be dramatic. I stood in that kitchen with my bag still on my shoulder and the cold evening air still clinging to my coat, and I read those 6 words until my hands stopped shaking enough to let me move. Eleanor hadn't eaten in 2 days. She hadn't had water in nearly as long. I found her in the back bedroom, the small one that had been a guest room before Carol decided Eleanor would be more comfortable there, away from the main part of the house, away from the windows that face the garden, away from the sounds of ordinary life. She was lying on her side on top of the covers, fully dressed in the cardigan she'd been wearing when I left for work 2 mornings ago, her white hair loose around her face, her breathing so shallow and labored that I heard it from the doorway before I even turned on the light. The bedside table held an empty glass and a plate with the dried remnants of what had been, 2 days ago, a piece of toast. Her lips were cracked. Her skin, when I pressed the back of my hand gently to her forehead, was papery and dry in a way that made something animal inside me clench with fear. I called her name. She opened her eyes, those sharp, pewter-gray eyes that had always held more intelligence and patience than any 83-year-old person's eyes should rightfully hold. And she looked at me with a steadiness that was almost uncanny, given how obviously depleted she was. "Sarah," she said. Her voice was a cracked whisper like old leather. "I was wondering when you'd get home." I reached for my phone to call an ambulance. Her hand, ice cold, the fingers thin as bird bones, closed around my wrist with a grip that surprised me, given everything. She was not strong, but she was deliberate. She held my wrist and she looked at me and she said with great and deliberate calm, "Don't call the doctors, not yet." I started to argue, started to tell her she was dehydrated, that she needed medical attention immediately, that I wasn't going to simply, "Listen to me," she said. Her grip tightened, fractionally, enough to hold my attention. "Under the dresser, there is a loose board, brown envelope. Take it to your car before you do anything else. Read what's inside." She released my wrist. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. "Then you'll understand," she said, "why they will soon be begging me for mercy." I had been married to Daniel Calloway for 2 years and 4 months when that evening happened. We had dated for 18 months before that, which meant I had been part of the Calloway family ecosystem. If you could call it a family, if you could call it an ecosystem rather than a weather system, a persistent climate of low pressure and shifting fronts, for nearly 4 years. I had been, for most of those 4 years, the kind of person who managed difficult situations by absorbing them quietly, by finding the path of least resistance, by telling myself that my own discomfort was less important than keeping the peace. I had been, in the language I would only find later, a fixer, a soother, a woman who believed that if she was patient enough, gentle enough, accommodating enough, the difficult people in her life would eventually soften toward her and the house would fill with warmth. The house itself was part of what had made me feel, in the beginning, that I was building something real and solid. It was a colonial in Fairfield County, not grand but substantial, with a deep front porch and old maple trees that turned a spectacular burning orange in October, and fat hydrangea bushes along the fence line that bloomed in heavy blue clusters every July. Daniel had told me on our third date that the house had been in his family for 30 years, that his grandfather had bought it before Daniel's father was born, that it was, and he had used this word with a quiet proprietorial satisfaction, his inheritance. The one tangible thing his family had managed to hold on to through the various upheavals of the Callaway decades, his grandfather's early death, his father's gambling, Carol's 2 failed marriages, and 1 spectacular bankruptcy. The house stood. Daniel owned it, he said, free and clear. We moved in after the wedding, and I remember the sensation of standing in the kitchen on our first morning there, sunlight coming through the east window, coffee brewing, the maple trees just beginning to blush with early autumn color, thinking that this was the life I had been working toward, steady, real, built on ground that belonged to us. I had a good job, senior account manager at a mid-sized marketing firm in Bridgeport, a job I had spent 6 years building from a junior assistant position through sheer determined competence. I earned well, not extravagantly, but well enough that my salary carried most of our living expenses, while Daniel navigated what he called a professional transition, a phrase that had been accurate 18 months ago and had since become something more like a permanent state of being. Daniel was charming and easy and funny in social situations, and he loved me in the uncomplicated way that certain people love things they haven't had to work very hard to obtain. He kissed me on the forehead every morning before I left for work. He remembered to pick up the dry cleaning. He made a genuinely excellent pasta. He was, by most reasonable measures, a good husband, right up until the moment he wasn't. Carol. Where does one begin with Carol? She was 57 years old with dyed dark hair and the kind of energy that fills rooms sideways, that doesn't announce itself so much as occupy available space. She wore heavy perfume, a musky, persistent cloud of something amber and dark that I would smell on Daniel's coat sometimes when he came back from visiting her, a smell that would linger in the fabric for days. She was not unkind to me exactly in the early years. She was something more difficult to name, selectively present, capable of great warmth when she wanted something, and an elaborate theatrical vagueness when she did not. She called me honey in a tone that managed every single time to convey the faintest possible shade of condescension. The way you'd say honey to a child who has set the table incorrectly, but whose feelings you don't especially want to hurt. She never forgot a slight, and she never forgave one either, though she was gifted enough to never let you see either of these facts directly. Eleanor Whitmore was Daniel's paternal grandmother, his father's mother, not Carol's relation at all, though Carol had managed to position herself as Eleanor's primary advocate in a way that I understood only in retrospect, and only after I found the envelope. Eleanor had lived alone in a studio apartment in Norwalk for the 12 years since her husband Arthur had died, and she had done so with complete competence and contentment, from everything I could observe. She was sharp. She read 2 newspapers every day. She did the crossword in pen. She had opinions about foreign policy and strong preferences in wine, and a dry, precise humor that I found genuinely delightful. She was not, in any meaningful sense of the word, a burden. But 8 months before that Thursday evening, she had fallen in her bathroom. A minor fall, a bruised hip, nothing broken. And Carol had materialized within 48 hours with a plan. Eleanor should come and stay with Daniel and Sarah. Just until she's back on her feet, Carol said, in the voice she used when a decision had already been made and was merely being announced in the form of a suggestion. It's the sensible thing. We're family." Eleanor had looked at me across Carol's kitchen table during that conversation with an expression I couldn't read then, a measuring look, patient and alert, like a chess player watching an opponent set up a trap they haven't seen yet. She had moved into our back bedroom the following week, and she had settled in with a quietness that I now understood had never been passivity. It had been attention. She had been watching. The whole 8 months she had been in our house, through Carol's increasingly frequent visits, through Daniel's increasingly frequent absences, through the way the temperature in a room changed when Carol mentioned Eleanor's finances. Eleanor had been watching and remembering and preparing. I didn't see any of that then. What I saw was a small, white-haired woman who drank her morning tea from a blue and white china cup that she'd brought from her apartment, who said, "Thank you, dear," in a way that sounded like she actually meant it, and who occasionally, on quiet evenings when Daniel was out and Carol hadn't come over, would sit with me in the living room and ask me questions about my work with a real particular curiosity that Daniel himself had never demonstrated. She'd been kind to me in the unshowy way that the truly good are kind. Not performing it, just doing it, as a matter of natural habit. I had grown fond of her, genuinely fond in the way that crept up on you quietly without announcement, the way the best things usually do. I should have noticed sooner. I should have connected the threads earlier. But I was busy, and I was tired, and I trusted the people who had given me no real reason to trust them, which is the oldest story in the world, and still somehow always a surprise when it turns out to be yours. The first thread I noticed but didn't pull was about money. It was a Saturday morning in January, perhaps 5 months before everything unraveled, and Carol had come over for what she called a family brunch, a phrase that had been coined by Carol and exclusively meant that Carol arrived at 9 a.m., required feeding, and spent approximately 2 hours making observations about the house, the furniture, and my cooking that were phrased as questions but functioned as criticisms. I was making eggs in the kitchen when I heard Carol in the hallway outside Eleanor's room, her voice pitched just below conversational, that register that isn't quite a whisper but is performing the idea of privacy. I couldn't make out individual words. I heard Eleanor's voice in response, shorter, clipped, then Carol's again, longer, the cadence of someone explaining something or justifying something or pressing a point, then silence. Carol came into the kitchen 2 minutes later with her public smile fully deployed, wide, warm, entirely separate from her eyes, and sat down at the counter and said, "So, honey, how's work? You must be exhausted. You're always working so hard." And I handed her a coffee and said work was fine, and I didn't ask what they'd been talking about because I had already, in the 4 years I had known Carol, learned that asking Carol direct questions produced answers that were elaborate, adjacent to the truth, and ultimately more confusing than no answer at all. But that evening, after Carol left and Daniel had gone to his friend Marcus's to watch a game, I went to check on Eleanor and found her sitting very upright in her chair with her hands folded in her lap and an expression on her face that I can only describe as controlled. She looked at me when I came in and said, "Sarah, do you know where Daniel keeps the household documents, the property records?" I told her they were in the filing cabinet in the study, in a folder labeled House. She nodded. "Has he ever shown them to you?" I said no, not specifically that I'd glanced at them when we first moved in. She nodded again. She said. Then, "Your eggs this morning were very good. The chives made all the difference." And she picked up her newspaper, and that was the end of the conversation. I thought about it on my way to bed. I thought briefly about going to the filing cabinet and looking through the property records. Then Daniel came home smelling of beer and laughing about something Marcus had said, and he kissed me and asked if there was any pasta left, and the thought dissolved the way inconvenient thoughts do when you are tired, and the person next to you is warm and familiar, and you have, still, a fundamental investment in the belief that your life is what it appears to be. The second thread was in February. I came home from work early on a Wednesday. A migraine, the kind that settles behind one eye like a slow, insistent pressure, and let myself in through the back door and heard from the direction of Eleanor's room voices. Not Eleanor's voice and Carol's voice, which would have been ordinary. Daniel's voice and Carol's voice, low and quick, the cadence of a conversation between people who know they are not supposed to be having it. I stood in the back hall with my coat half off and listened, and the only fragment I caught clearly before Daniel's voice dropped even lower was Carol saying, "Can't keep waiting. If she changes her mind," and Daniel saying something urgent and inaudible in response. Then Carol, "It's fine. She doesn't know about the other account. She has no idea." I walked into the kitchen loudly enough that they could hear me. By the time I got to the living room, Daniel was coming out of Eleanor's hallway with a relaxed, easy expression and saying, "Hey, you're home early. Headache? Let me get you something." And Carol was behind him with her coat already on and her purse over her arm, saying she was just leaving. Wasn't that funny? She'd stopped by to check on Eleanor, and Daniel happened to be working from home. He hadn't mentioned working from home. I took the ibuprofen he brought me, and I lay down in our room with the curtains closed, and I thought very carefully about the phrase "she doesn't know about the other account." I decided, in the dark behind my closed eyes, that it referred to something legitimate, that Carol was perhaps talking about a savings account related to Eleanor's care costs, something administrative, something that had a sensible explanation I wasn't aware of. I decided this because the alternative was something I did not yet have the evidence or the courage to fully consider. The third thread came from Eleanor herself in March, on a gray afternoon when the last of the snow was turning to sullen brown slush on the lawn, and Eleanor and I were drinking tea in the living room while Daniel was out and the house was quiet. We'd been talking about nothing particular, a documentary we'd both seen about migratory birds, a book Eleanor was reading about the Ottoman Empire, when she set down her cup and looked at me and said, with a precision that I would only later understand was deliberate, "You're a very capable woman, Sarah. You notice things. You just haven't let yourself act on what you notice yet." I started to demur, to say something self-deprecating, and she held up one thin hand. "That will change," she said. "When the time comes, you'll know exactly what to do. I have a lot of confidence in you." Then she picked up her book and went back to reading, and I sat with the strange, particular weight of those words settling somewhere in my chest, like a stone that had found its resting place. Something was different about Daniel in April. The warmth that had always been his primary characteristic, the easy affection, the forehead kisses, and the good-natured humor. It hadn't disappeared exactly, but it had become intermittent in a way it had never been before, flickering on and off like a light with a loose connection. He was on his phone constantly, not in the open, careless way of someone scrolling social media, but in the careful, private way of someone managing something. He took calls in the garage. He left the dinner table to answer texts. Twice I walked into the kitchen and he ended a call mid-sentence and slipped the phone into his pocket and said with a slightly too casual smile, "Just Marcus." I smiled back. I was becoming, I realized now, an expert at receiving performances I knew were performances without acknowledging that I knew, because the gap between knowing and acknowledging felt at the time like a chasm I was not yet ready to cross. Eleanor watched all of this too. I know this now. I can trace it backward. The way her eyes tracked Daniel when he came into her room, the polite questions she asked about his work, the careful attention she paid to Carol's comments about planning and the future and what's best for everyone. She was building her case. She had been building it for months, quietly, methodically, with the patience of someone who has lived long enough to understand that the most effective kind of justice is the kind that arrives fully prepared. I found the loose board on the first try. Eleanor had described its location with the kind of precision that told me she had planned this moment. She had rehearsed the instructions in her head, possibly many times. The dresser was old, solid walnut, positioned against the east wall of her room, and the loose board was at its base, a short plank that lifted free when I pressed its left edge, revealing a shallow cavity perhaps 2 inches deep. The brown envelope inside was thicker than I expected, sealed with several strips of packing tape layered over the flap, and it had my name written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting, Sarah Calloway. The letters were unhurried and perfectly even, the handwriting of a woman who had been a legal secretary for 20 years before she married Arthur and had never lost the discipline of clear, authoritative penmanship. I carried the envelope under my arm, through the house, out the back door, and to my car. I got in. I locked the door. I sat for a moment in the darkening evening, the streetlights just beginning to come on in the thin gray dusk, and I held the envelope in both hands and felt the weight of whatever it contained and tried to prepare myself for the information inside it. I couldn't, of course. There's no real preparation for the specific quality of ground shifting beneath you, for the sensation of a floor you had trusted completely, revealing itself to be made of paper. I broke the tape carefully. I opened the envelope and removed its contents in a stack and laid them on the passenger seat under the interior light. On top was a handwritten note, 1 page, in Eleanor's script. I read it before anything else. Sarah. If you are reading this, then Daniel and Carol have done something predictable and stupid, and you have done something I always suspected you were capable of. You stayed. You didn't leave me. Take everything in this envelope to James Whitmore. His card is clipped to the back of this letter. He has been my attorney for 19 years, and he is the only person outside this envelope who knows its full contents. Call him before you do anything else, before you confront anyone, before you call the police. James first. He will know what to do. Whatever you feel when you read what's here, and you will feel a great deal. Stay cold. Stay careful. Be the version of yourself you haven't had to be yet. You are ready for this. E.W. James Whitmore's card was there, clipped precisely as promised. A downtown Bridgeport address, a direct line, a handwritten addendum in Eleanor's pen. He's expecting your call. He has been for 3 months. I set the note aside and picked up the next document. It was a property deed. The address at the top was our address. The colonial with the maples, the hydrangeas, the porch where I drank my coffee every Sunday morning. The name on the deed as sole owner was Eleanor Grace Whitmore, not Daniel Calloway, not Daniel and Sarah Calloway. Eleanor Grace Whitmore in full, clear, unambiguous type, with a recording date that preceded our move-in by 11 years. I turned the page. There was a second document behind it. A letter from a title company, dated 8 months ago, confirming that no transfer of ownership had been recorded, no sale, no gift deed, no change of any kind. The house was Eleanor's. It had always been Eleanor's. There was no mortgage. There had never been a mortgage. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the mortgage payment, $1,500 a month that I had been transferring into the household account every month for 2 years, money that I had understood to be going toward the property we jointly owned, money that had been described to me in terms of equity and investment and building something together. I thought about where that money had actually gone. The room felt very small suddenly, very close, and the sound of my own breathing was too loud in the silence of the locked car. The next documents were bank statements, Eleanor's name on the account. 18 months of statements highlighted in yellow in dozens of places. each highlight corresponding to a withdrawal or transfer, with Carol M. Calloway noted as the authorized signatory on a signature card stapled to the front page. $147,320, moved across 18 months in increments small enough to avoid automatic bank flagging. $6,000 here, $8,500 there, to an account in Carol's name. There was a sticky note in Eleanor's handwriting attached to the first statement. It said simply, "I did not authorize any of this." Behind the bank statements, a folded printout of a document titled Declaration of Diminished Mental Capacity, signed by one Dr. Marcus P. Webb, dated 4 months ago, declaring Eleanor to be of compromised cognitive function and recommending that a health and financial proxy be appointed. The proxy named was Carol M. Calloway. I stared at that document for a long time. Dr. Marcus P. Webb, whose signature was at the bottom in a confident, practiced hand. I thought of Carol producing this document in some future crisis, some confrontation, some accusation, laying it on a table and saying in her most reasonable voice, "She's confused, honey. She imagines things," the doctor said. The last item in the envelope was a small digital voice recorder, black and rectangular, about the size of a large thumb drive, with a post-it note on it bearing a single instruction: play from beginning. I found the play button, I pressed it, and I sat in my car on a Thursday evening in October and listened to my mother-in-law's voice fill the small, still space around me like gas filling a room. The recording was a conversation. 2 voices, Carol and Daniel. The quality was slightly muffled. The recorder had been hidden somewhere soft, a drawer perhaps, or under a cushion. But the words were clear enough. I would later learn from James that Eleanor had been collecting recordings for 6 months. Carol's voice: "She's been worse this week. I don't know how much longer this can go on." Daniel: "What do you want me to do, Mom? I can't exactly speed things up." Carol: "No one's saying that. I'm saying be patient, be strategic. The trust documentation, the primary account. She's never told Sarah about any of it. Sarah thinks the savings account is everything." A pause. Sarah thinks she's just a sweet old lady on a fixed income. Daniel, lower. "What about the house? Sarah's going to want to know about the title eventually." Carol: "Let me worry about that. I have the capacity document. Once that's filed with the court, we have a legal basis to manage her affairs. And manage—" The sound of something shifting, a chair, perhaps, "includes the house." Daniel, quieter. "I don't love this." Carol's voice hardening, just perceptibly at its edges. "You don't have to love it. You have to be present. When it happens, you need to be out of state, or at least out of the house. Grief is more convincing from a distance." A pause. "Take Sarah somewhere, a trip. The shore. Make sure she's not here being dramatic." Daniel, after a silence: "She's gotten attached to Grandma." Carol: "I know. That's a problem we're going to need to manage. Sarah's sentimental. It won't take much to convince her that Eleanor wanted privacy, that she refused medical help, that she was confused at the end." Another pause. A sound I couldn't identify. "She believes what you tell her, Daniel. She always has." I turned the recorder off. I sat in the dark for a long time. I am not sure how long. Long enough for the streetlights to finish coming on, for the neighbor's dog to bark twice and go silent, for the cold to seep properly through the car's metal and glass and settle around me like something physical and final. She believes what you tell her, Daniel. She always has. I turned those words over in the silence of my own mind, felt their full weight, their full meaning, the years of small manipulations and easy reassurances, and stories accepted without question that they implied. I felt the specific quality of that anger, not hot, not volatile, not the kind of anger that makes you want to cry or shout, cold, precise, clean as a blade just removed from ice, the anger of someone who is finally, completely, and irrevocably understood. I picked up my phone and dialed James Whitmore's direct line. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Calloway," he said, without waiting for me to speak. His voice was measured, experienced, the voice of someone who had been navigating difficult situations for a long time and had learned not to be ruffled by them. "I've been expecting your call. Is Eleanor all right?" I told him she was alive but dehydrated and needed medical attention. "Good," he said. "Call her doctor directly. I'm sending you the number now. It'll come through as a text. Not the emergency services, not her GP on file, because that GP was recommended by Carol Calloway, and I have questions about his independence. Dr. Priya Mehta. She knows the situation. She's been briefed. She'll come to the house within the hour." He paused. "Did you read everything in the envelope?" I said yes. "And you found the recorder?" "Yes." "Good. I need you to bring all of it to my office tomorrow morning. But tonight, don't confront anyone. Don't let Carol or Daniel know what you found. Can you do that?" I told him I could. I told him, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice, that I was ready to do whatever needed to be done. "Excellent," James said. And then, with something that might have been a quiet satisfaction, "Eleanor said you would be." I went back inside. I returned the envelope to the cavity under the dresser. James had told me to leave it there until he could have it professionally documented and photographed in situ. I sat beside Eleanor's bed and helped her drink water. Small sips every few minutes, the way you'd hydrate someone who had gone without for too long. She was alert, clearer than she'd been when I first found her, the way dehydration can mask itself as decline and retreat rapidly with basic care. Dr. Mehta arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. A small, calm woman with a medical bag and the efficient manner of someone who wasted no time, and assessed Eleanor thoroughly while I waited in the kitchen. She came out 20 minutes later and told me Eleanor was dehydrated and malnourished, but otherwise stable, that there was no immediate crisis requiring hospital transport, that she would leave IV fluids and electrolytes and return in the morning, and that what had been done to this woman by her family constituted, in Dr. Mehta's quiet but unambiguous opinion, elder neglect. That night, I slept on the floor of Eleanor's room on a folded blanket with my phone beside me and the recorder inside my coat pocket. I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark and listened to Eleanor's breathing gradually deepen and steady and become something less ragged, and I thought about 2 years of my life inside a house that was never mine, with a man who had been, at best, a coward, and, at worst, a deliberate architect of a plan to reduce his dying grandmother to an obstacle and collect her assets while I stood in the kitchen making eggs and believing I was building something. I thought about the $1,500 a month, $22,500 of my earned income, transferred faithfully for 18 months into an account whose purpose I had accepted without examination, because Daniel had told me it was the mortgage, and Daniel was my husband, and I had believed what he told me. I thought about Carol's voice on that recording, her tone when she said Sarah's sentimental as though it were a diagnosis, a deficiency, something to be exploited rather than something to be ashamed of exploiting. I thought about all the moments over 4 years in which I had made myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating in the service of a peace that had never actually existed. And then I stopped thinking about the past, because the past was done and the present required my full attention. They came back on Saturday afternoon. I heard Carol's car in the driveway first, the specific sound of her silver sedan's engine, which I had learned to recognize with a particular quality of dread, and then the sound of the front door, and Carol's voice in the hall saying something bright and performative about sea air and much needed. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I did not get up. Daniel came into the kitchen first. He was tanned, relaxed in the way of someone who had spent 2 days deliberately not thinking about difficult things. He looked at me, and something shifted in his expression, some small, rapid recalibration, and then he pulled the relaxed smile back over it and said, "Hey, everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. My voice was completely even. "Eleanor is resting. She's stable." Carol came in behind him, dropping her bag on the counter with the proprietary ease of someone in their own space, and said, "Oh, good. I worried you'd be dramatic about the whole thing. She's always refusing to eat. She's been doing it for weeks. You can't force someone to—" "Carol," I said. She stopped. "Sit down," I said. Something moved in her eyes, a quick, assessing flash, like a card player glancing at a hand they haven't expected. She looked at Daniel. He was still looking at me with that expression I couldn't quite decode. Wariness, or guilt, or something closer to recognition. She pulled out a chair and sat, and Daniel sat beside her, and I sat across from them both, and I put my hands flat on the table and I looked at them. "I've spoken with James Whitmore," I said. The silence that followed was complete. Carol's face didn't change. She was too practiced for that. But something around her eyes compressed, a micro-tightening, the involuntary response of a person processing a significant threat. Daniel looked at the table. "James has been expecting my call for 3 months," I said. "He has copies of the property deed. He has copies of the bank statements. 18 months of statements, Carol, with your signature on the authorization card. He has a copy of the Declaration of Diminished Mental Capacity signed by Dr. Marcus Webb, who, James tells me, surrendered his Connecticut license 4 years ago and cannot legally sign any medical documentation in this state." I paused. "He has also been in contact with the state licensing board and with the detective assigned to the Elder Financial Abuse Unit at the Fairfield County Sheriff's Office." I let that land. "They have been expecting his call." Carol's lips pressed together into a thin, colorless line. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Eleanor is confused. She has episodes. Whatever she's told you." "Eleanor didn't tell me anything," I said. "Eleanor showed me where to find documentation she has been collecting for 6 months. Her own documentation, in her own handwriting, with recorded conversations." I watched Carol's face. "I believe you know what conversations I mean." The color left Carol's face, not dramatically, just a quiet, steady drainage, like water leaving a bathtub, until what remained was a pale, composed mask behind which something urgent and frightened was working very hard not to show itself. She looked at Daniel. Daniel was still looking at the table. He had gone very still. His hands were in his lap and his jaw was tight, and he had the appearance of a man who has been braced for something for a long time and has finally, with a complicated mixture of dread and relief, arrived at the moment he has been bracing for. "Daniel," Carol said, her voice sharp with an authority she had clearly exercised over him his entire life, "don't say anything." He looked up at me. His eyes were tired. He looked like a man who had not slept well in months, the kind of tired that isn't physical, that lives behind the eyes and weighs down the corners of the mouth, and is the specific tiredness of someone who has known they were doing something wrong and kept doing it anyway. "How much of the recording did you hear?" he said. "Daniel," Carol said again, harder. "All of it," I said. He exhaled. Long and slow and hollow, like air leaving something. "I didn't know about the bank account," he said. "I swear to you, Sarah, I didn't know she'd been taking money. I knew about the house. I knew it was Grandma's. I should have told you, I know that. But I didn't know about the account." He looked at his mother. "You told me she had agreed. You told me it was a loan, that she understood." Carol said nothing. "You told me she had agreed," he said again, and there was something breaking in his voice, something that had been waiting a long time to break. "She didn't agree," I said quietly. "She didn't authorize any of it. She's been watching and recording for 6 months because she couldn't trust anyone in this house to protect her. She couldn't trust her own grandson. I kept my voice level. There was no point in anger here. The anger was still there, cold and clean at my core, but it had no productive application in this conversation. James is filing for an emergency protective order on Eleanor's behalf tomorrow morning. The Elder Abuse Unit has already opened an investigation based on the documentation James submitted this afternoon. Dr. Mehta will provide a medical affidavit about the condition Eleanor was in when I found her. I picked up my coffee cup and set it back down. You should both probably speak to attorneys. Carol stood up. Her chair scraped back against the kitchen tiles with a sound like something tearing. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the seams of it, the careful stitching that kept the composure in place over whatever was happening underneath. "Eleanor is an old woman who is confused and paranoid and has clearly manipulated you into believing." "The forged doctor's declaration," I said. "That's a felony in Connecticut. Financial exploitation of an elder, that's also a felony. The amount involved, $147,000. That's significant prison exposure, Carol, not probation. Prison." I looked at her steadily. James made sure I understood the applicable statutes. Carol looked at Daniel. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his hands. She picked up her purse. She straightened her jacket. She assumed, with what I had to acknowledge was a formidable act of will, the posture and expression of someone who has decided to treat a catastrophe as a minor inconvenience. "I'm going to my attorney," she said. "Daniel, come." Daniel didn't move. Daniel. He kept looking at his hands. Carol left. The front door closed behind her with a quietness that was somehow worse than a slam. I listened to her car start, back out of the driveway, disappear down the street. The house was very quiet. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator made its low domestic hum. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Eleanor breathing. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. I looked at him. I thought about the right response, the proportionate response, the one that contained all of the appropriate complexity of 2 years of marriage and 4 years of relationship and $1,700 a month and all the small moments in which I had trusted him and he had known things he hadn't told me. I thought about what I wanted to say. I found, when I actually looked for the feeling, that I was too tired for the kind of grief that requires performance. What I felt was quieter and more final than that. "I know," I said. "But sorry isn't enough, Daniel. You knew the house wasn't ours. You let me believe it was. You let me pay into an account for 2 years without telling me the truth. And you knew, on some level, what your mother was doing to Eleanor." I paused. She was depending on us. She was an 83-year-old woman who needed people to protect her, and instead she had to protect herself from her own family. I stood up. "I need you to find somewhere else to stay tonight, and tomorrow and for the foreseeable future. If you want to help yourself legally, you should tell James's investigator everything you know about your mother's activities. That's the one thing I can tell you that might matter." He nodded. He looked for the first time in a long time like himself. Not the easy, charming version, not the careful performance of it, but something more honest and more tired and less comfortable, which was closer to real. He stood up and he went to the bedroom, and I heard him moving around in there for a while, and then the sound of the front door again, and then just the kitchen clock and the refrigerator and Eleanor's breathing down the hall. I went to Eleanor's room. She was awake, propped on her pillows, the blue and white china cup on the bedside table with fresh tea in it. Dr. Mehta had made it before she left, at Eleanor's specific request. Eleanor looked at me when I came in with the expression I had seen on her face that first evening, the one I hadn't been able to read. I could read it now. It was patience. The patience of someone who has waited a very long time for the right person to walk through the door. "Well," she said. Well, I said, and sat down in the chair beside her bed. Did Carol leave dramatically? Quietly, actually, which seemed worse. Eleanor considered this. She's always been more dangerous when she's quiet, she said. The dramatics are camouflage. She sipped her tea. Outside, the October dark had fully settled, and the maple trees in the front yard were invisible now, just the occasional sound of wind moving through them. Daniel. He's gone to find somewhere to stay. He's going to cooperate with the investigation. Eleanor set down her cup carefully. He was always weak, she said without particular bitterness. His father was too. Calloway men. They love their mothers too much and their wives not enough. She looked at me. You deserved better. I know, I said. I'm beginning to understand how much. A quiet settled over the room that was different from the tense, watchful quiet of the past months. This was something softer, exhausted maybe, but not anxious. The house, Eleanor said after a while. James explained. You own it. You've always owned it. Yes. She paused. I bought it for Arthur 51 years ago. We raised Daniel's father in it. I've watched 3 generations come and go from these rooms. Another pause. I always intended for it to go to someone who would actually live in it. Someone who would be good to it. She looked at me directly. I rewrote my will 18 months ago when I realized what Carol was planning. James has the current version. It supersedes everything else. She let that settle. You should know what it says. I told her she didn't have to tell me tonight. I want to, she said simply. It leaves you the house and the trust, which Carol doesn't know about, which has never appeared on any of the documents she's managed to access. Arthur was very careful about separating his assets. He didn't trust Carol either. The shadow of a smile crossed her face. He had good instincts. $2.3 million. It goes to you and to the children's cancer ward at Yale New Haven Hospital in equal parts. She held up a hand before I could speak. Don't protest. I'm 83 years old and I've had decades to think about what I want to do with what Arthur and I built together. The house needs someone who will keep the hydrangeas, and the cancer ward, well, she looked at her hands. We lost Arthur's sister to leukemia a very long time ago. It's been on my mind for a while. I sat with that for a long time. The weight of it. Not the money, though the money was real and significant, but the quality of the trust it represented. The decision this woman had made over months and years of careful, patient observation to place everything she and Arthur had built into the hands of a woman who had simply, on an ordinary Thursday evening, come home from work and made sure she had water. Eleanor, I said. My voice was not quite steady. I'm going to make sure they face every consequence that's coming to them. Every one. She looked at me with those gray eyes, ancient and sharp and warm, and she said, I know, dear. That's why I chose you. James Whitmore was, as advertised, exactly the kind of attorney you want when the machinery of justice needs to move with precision and speed. He was in his early 60s, lean with a manner of unhurried competence that I found deeply reassuring in those first raw days when everything I thought I had understood about my life was being replaced by a different, harder, truer map. He had known Eleanor for 19 years. She had come to him initially to handle her estate after Arthur died, and they had, over those years, developed the kind of relationship that exists between two people who genuinely respect each other's intelligence and don't waste each other's time. When Eleanor had begun to understand, approximately 8 months ago, what Carol was planning, she had gone to James and told him everything she knew, and James had quietly, methodically begun building the case that I had now walked into from the other side. The emergency protective order was granted Monday morning. It named Carol Calloway as a person prohibited from any contact with Eleanor Whitmore, physical or financial, pending the outcome of the investigation. The forged Dr. Marcus Webb declaration was submitted to the state attorney's office by Tuesday. Dr. Mehta's affidavit, detailing Eleanor's condition when she had first examined her, consistent with deliberate neglect over a period of not less than 48 hours, was filed Wednesday. The financial records went to the Elder Abuse Unit on Thursday. James had prepared everything with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of someone who had been doing this for a very long time, and he moved through the process with a serenity that I found, in the lurching anxiety of those days, almost physically stabilizing. Carol retained an attorney, a combative man named Ellsworth, whose reputation, James told me without expression, was somewhat better than his methods. Ellsworth contacted James's office Thursday morning with what was described, in the subsequent communication I read, as a series of alternative interpretations of the evidence. Eleanor had gifted the money voluntarily and had subsequently forgotten doing so. The property situation was a family arrangement that Sarah Calloway had misunderstood. Dr. Webb, while no longer licensed, had provided the capacity assessment as a personal favor and in good faith. I read these alternative interpretations in James's office on Friday morning and felt the cold thing in my chest solidify a little further, the way ice thickens when the temperature keeps dropping, that Carol would sit across a table from the facts, from the recordings, from the bank statements, from the forged doctor's signature, and construct a story this distant from them was, I realized, not a sign of confidence. It was a sign of someone who has spent decades manipulating reality through the sheer force of assertion and has not yet fully understood that the person she is dealing with is not Daniel. It is not some credulous, exhausted woman who believes what she's told. The records don't believe what they're told. The recordings don't. The probate court doesn't. James filed a civil suit for the recovery of the $147,000 that same Friday. The criminal referral handled by the Elder Abuse Unit resulted in Carol's arrest on the following Tuesday. 2 counts of elder financial exploitation, a Class C felony in Connecticut, carrying a potential sentence of up to 10 years, 1 count of forgery in the first degree. She was photographed and fingerprinted and released on bail, and the photograph that appeared on the local news website that evening showed her in the parking lot of the Bridgeport Police Department in her good coat, her face arranged in an expression of dignified offense that would have been impressive if it hadn't been, by that point, so deeply and thoroughly beside the point. Daniel cooperated fully with investigators, as I had suggested. He confirmed the property situation, confirmed his awareness of it, confirmed that he had accepted his mother's framing, that Eleanor had agreed to various arrangements that Eleanor, in fact, had not agreed to. He was not charged. Whether that was justice or mercy or simply prosecutorial pragmatism, whether the distinction between active complicity and passive enabling is as meaningful as it sounds when the person being harmed is an 83-year-old woman who went 2 days without water, I genuinely don't know. I have thought about it many times in the months since, and I have not yet arrived at a settled answer. What I have arrived at is the understanding that it is not my responsibility to arrive at one. The law made its determination. I made mine, which was that Daniel and I were finished, not in anger, not with the scorched earth drama that the situation might have seemed to warrant, but with the quiet, definitive finality that comes when you understand that the gap between who you needed someone to be and who they actually are is not a gap that love or time or forgiveness can bridge, because it is not a gap in the relationship. It is a gap in the person. I filed for divorce in November. James handled that too, with the same efficient precision he brought to everything. It was straightforward in the legal sense. We had no children, and the question of property was significantly simplified by the fact that the property had never been Daniel's to begin with. He didn't contest anything. He signed what was required and moved into a rental apartment in Stamford, and the last time I saw him, he looked older than he had 6 months earlier, and tired in a way that I recognized as the specific tiredness of someone who is beginning the long, difficult work of understanding the kind of person they have been. Carol's trial was set for the following spring. In the meantime, she was restricted from any contact with Eleanor, and the bail conditions limited her movements substantially. I heard through James that she was living at her sister's house in New Haven and had consulted 4 different attorneys in 2 months, each of whom had, apparently, told her variations of the same thing. The case against her was substantial, the recordings were damning, and the wisest course was to negotiate rather than litigate. Carol, being Carol, had not yet accepted this advice. She would. Eventually, the weight of the evidence tends to produce a certain clarity. Eleanor recovered. Not fully. 83 is 83, and the neglect of those 2 days had taken something from her that wasn't fully recouped. But enough. Enough to sit in the garden on mild afternoons in a good wool coat and tend her tomato plants, which had been transferred from her old apartment and repotted into the raised beds along the south side of the house. Enough to give her formal deposition for the prosecution with a clarity and precision that, James told me afterward, had left the interviewing detective visibly moved. Enough to drink her tea from the blue and white cup every morning while we went over the crossword together, her pen moving across the boxes with the unhurried confidence of someone who has always trusted her own mind. The trust was transferred to me in January, following the probate court's verification of Eleanor's revised will, $2.3 million, and the house. I sat with James in his office on the day the paperwork was finalized, and I looked at the numbers on the transfer document, and I felt, not elation, not the kind of triumph I might have expected. I felt something quiet and large, the way feelings are when they have been earned rather than inherited as drama. Something that settled instead of soared. Eleanor sat beside me in James's office, signing her name with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and when it was done, she folded her copy of the transfer order neatly in thirds and said, "Well, that's that." James poured water for us both. Outside, January light moved flat and silver across the harbor. We walked 2 blocks to a restaurant that did excellent lobster bisque, the 3 of us, and sat at a corner table and ate in the comfortable silence of people who have finished something difficult together and are allowing themselves, quietly, to know it. Carol's trial began in April. I attended every session, not out of cruelty. I took no pleasure in watching the machinery of justice process a person, even this person. What I felt was something more principled, a conviction that what had happened in that back bedroom deserved to be witnessed. Eleanor provided her deposition in writing. Her doctor had advised against the physical strain of attending in person. When it was read into the record on the second day, I watched the jury's faces as the words were spoken aloud, and I was glad to be there. Ellsworth, Carol's attorney, was technically skilled and morally unconcerned, which is a combination that produces a certain efficient ugliness in a courtroom. He argued diminished capacity, Eleanor's, not his client's. He argued that the bank withdrawals reflected informal family arrangements, mischaracterized after relationships deteriorated. He argued that the forged doctor's declaration had been a poorly advised administrative shortcut, taken in good faith. He laid out these arguments smoothly, and Carol sat beside him at the defendant's table, with her composure still technically intact, though the quality of it had changed. It was the composure of a wall during an earthquake, holding its shape while the ground beneath it shifted. The recording was played on the 3rd day. The courtroom was very quiet during the playback. Carol's voice filled the room from the evidence speaker with the same ambient familiarity it had always filled our kitchen. That specific cadence of certainty, that unhurried conviction that the people around her were manageable. "She believes what you tell her, Daniel. She always has." The words hung in the air after the recording ended. A juror in the second row, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, was looking at Carol with an expression that was not quite anger, but close enough that its effect was the same. Carol was looking at the table. The bank statements took most of the fourth day. A financial analyst walked through 18 months of carefully calibrated withdrawals. Amounts sized just below automatic fraud flagging thresholds, timed to coincide with periods when Eleanor was most isolated, until the account containing $161,000 had been reduced to $4,000. I watched a juror in the second row set down his pen and sit back and cross his arms, and I knew, in the way you know these things, that he had stopped deliberating. Dr. Mehta testified on the fifth day. She was composed and precise, describing Eleanor's condition that Thursday evening in clinical language that was somehow more devastating for its restraint than any dramatization would have been. When Ellsworth attempted to draw distinctions between deliberate neglect and natural age-related decline, she answered each question with a patience that never shaded into condescension, but made clear each time that the distinction he was reaching for was not a subtle one. I testified on the morning of the sixth day. I described finding Eleanor. I described the note. I described the envelope, the recording, the kitchen table conversation on Saturday afternoon. Ellsworth's cross-examination centered on my interested party status as beneficiary of the trust. I answered his questions directly and without defensiveness because the answer was simple. I had found an old woman dying and I had stayed, and the documentation spoke for itself regardless of what I felt. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. I spent most of it with James in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, reading a paperback I didn't absorb. When James's phone lit up with the notification, he looked at me and said, "Time to go." Guilty on both counts of elder financial exploitation. Guilty on the count of forgery in the first degree. I sat in the gallery and heard the words read in the clerk's flat, procedural voice, and I did not cry. Something eased instead. A long-held breath finally let go, a pressure that had been present so long it had begun to feel like a permanent condition. I looked at Carol. She was standing very straight, Ellsworth's hand on her arm, her face arranged in an expression I had no precise word for, the particular blankness of someone who has, for the first time, arrived at an outcome they could neither manage nor reframe nor talk their way out of. She did not look at me. I walked out of the courthouse into April sunlight and called Eleanor. "Well," she said before I'd spoken, "guilty, all 3 counts." 4 seconds of silence. Then, good. Not triumphant, not emotional. The tone of someone acknowledging a correct outcome, a proper accounting, something restored to its right place after a long time in the wrong one. "Come home," she said. "I'm making soup." I laughed, properly for the first time in a long time, and walked to the parking garage with the spring sun on my face. Sentencing was 4 years, with full restitution ordered. Carol relocated to New Mexico after her release. I received this information as a legal notification from James, read it at the kitchen table one morning while Eleanor did the crossword beside me, and set my phone face down and looked out at the garden and felt indifference. Not as an absence of feeling, but as the arrival of one. The specific indifference that comes after you've paid the full emotional price of something, the grief, the anger, the long and careful work of building something new on ground. You've cleared yourself. When that work is finished, the person who caused the original disruption becomes smaller. They take up less space. They become, eventually, just a person. "Carol's been released," I said. "She's moved to New Mexico." Eleanor looked up from the crossword. "Good," she said. "The chapter is closed. We have other things to read." She picked up her pen. The divorce was finalized in December. I signed the last page in James's office on a gray morning while snow flurried past the window, and I felt what you feel when something that was real is also properly over. Not severed, not discarded, but finished. A book closed at its last page. The marriage had been real. It had also been built on a foundation I'd been denied the information to properly assess. Both of these things were simultaneously true, and sitting with their simultaneousness was one of the harder disciplines of that year and one of the more important. The following September, I was sitting on the front porch with coffee when the maples began to turn. Not the full October blaze yet, just the first suggestion of it. Color spreading from the outer branches inward, the trees beginning to remember what they were capable of. Eleanor came out with her tea and settled into the other chair with the deliberate grace of someone who has learned to conserve strength without losing dignity. The radio played something slow through the screen door. The hydrangeas along the fence were going to their end-of-season dusty purple, heavy and magnificent in their declining. I had lost things. That remained true. A marriage. A version of a man I'd believed in. 2 years of payments transferred faithfully into an account whose purpose I'd accepted without examination. The particular version of my life that had been assembled from information I hadn't been given. These losses were real, and I did not minimize them. They were part of the geology of me now, visible if you knew where to look. But I had also come to understand something I could not have understood before all of it. That the woman who had walked into James Whitmore's office on a Thursday October evening, cold and clear-eyed and ready to do whatever needed to be done, had not been created by the crisis. She had been there already, waiting, the way the maple tree's full October color is already present in September. In every leaf, fully formed, just not yet expressed. Eleanor had known it. She had seen it before I could. She had pressed her cold fingers around my wrist in the dark and told me where to look, and trusted me with everything she had, because she was the kind of woman who recognized in others the thing she herself was made of. I finished my coffee. Eleanor finished her tea. The morning held us both. The trees went on turning, faithful and unhurried, toward October. I was home, completely, finally, and irrevocably home, and everything that needed to be said about that had already been said by the trees, by the woman beside me, by the quiet permanence of a house that had always belonged, in every way that mattered, to the people willing to stay.